I'm John Davis. I'm the Chief Security Officer for the federal sector at Palo Alto Networks. And I joined Palo Alto Networks last September after a 35-year career in the U.S. military. The last decade of which I spent a lot of time at the tactical, operational, strategic, and policy level in the military, and that's where I met all of these gentlemen. And so the panel today is about information sharing and next generation defense. And so I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists and dear friends. First of all, we have Jim Trainor. He is Assistant Director, Cyber Division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Next, we have Greg Touhill. Greg is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications at DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And finally, we have Mr. Steve Shirley. Steve is the Executive Director of the Defense Cyber Crime Center, DC3, for DoD. So what you have here is an assembly of people representing FBI, DHS, and DoD in their public-facing roles. And each has a federal cybersecurity center, NCIJTF for FBI, the NKIC for DHS, and DC3 for DoD. And these are all public-facing federal cybersecurity centers that are intimately involved in the aspect of information sharing. So what I'd like to do is pose a few questions to my panel and then save some time for Q&A at the end. And I'd like to start, the first question I'll pose to Greg. And we talk a lot about information sharing. You've heard a lot about that during discussion today. But exactly what are we talking about? What kind of information sharing? Can we be precise about what we're talking about? Because I think, especially in today's world, there's a lot of conflation between different kinds of information sharing. And there are a lot of issues associated with things like personally identifiable information, personal health information, intellectual property, private content. Those kind of issues bring up, sometimes can bring up serious friction and can be impediments to the information sharing that we all know is so important when addressing the cyber threats that we face today. So how do you view that, and how do you define information sharing when it comes to the cyber threats?
Well, thanks, John. You know, as we take a look at information sharing, particularly in the cyber realm, it is something that could be extremely wide when it comes time to figuring out, you know, who needs to know what and when and how, as well as the context. So we have a variety of different information sharing mechanisms because everybody represents a different constituency as far as what type of information do they want or need. A large company is going to look at a situation from a different standpoint from a small and medium business, for example. So what we've been trying to do is in defining what kind of information and how to share it, is we tried to do a couple of things. First of all, we bound by protecting brands, reputations, privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. That's baked into our processes. And we're going to tell you everything we know about the assailant while protecting the identities and the equities of the victims. So when we're sharing indicators, for example, and an indicator could be a IP address, it could be a digitized hash, it could be information that's coming in across the wire. We're going to share that information out as fast as we can, and we've just implemented this year an automated indicator sharing mechanism so we can go from machine to machine using a sticks and taxi format, with sticks being structured threat indicator expression, and taxi the protocol for sharing that, which is trusted automated exchange of indicator information. That's an example of a type of information that we share. We also work with our intelligence community partners to rapidly declassify and share information that will help set context. So it's more than just the actual indicators, but as textual elements. We also try to foster sharing within sectors through such things as information sharing analysis organizations and the operational arms of the sector coordinating councils, the information sharing and analysis centers. And sometimes just information sharing is sitting down with somebody who has like interests that are seeing something and are saying something, and having those kind of conversations. And we try to foster that as well. I don't think there's one particular definition, John, that says here is the ideal information to share. But rather what we've got to do as a federal government is make sure that we are sharing broadly all the type of information about the assailants so that people, based on their risk management construct, will be able to have the right information to make the right decisions.
Jim or Steve, would you like to add anything to that?
So as a follow-up to Greg, so I mean, one of the challenges is always balancing the equities that that law enforcement or the USIC has as it relates to one indicator is what are we going to share and how quickly we're going to share it. That doesn't necessarily inhibit our ability to continue to protect the country. So from an FBI perspective, the primary means for which we disseminate indicators of compromise, whether it's email addresses, YARA rules, snort rules, bad IPs, things of that nature, is the flash message. So we have a document that goes out in stick syntactic protocol as well that we allow for the dissemination of things that we know are malicious, and it allows for companies or organizations to take that data, put it in their systems to protect themselves. Greg and DHS, with the passage of CISA in December of 2015 with AIS, they have a very aggressive program, the Automated Indicating Share Initiative. And I'm proud to say that the FBI was the first government agency that linked up with DHS to receive and share indicators directly with AIS so they can push it out. So great initiative. It's going to take some time to build that capability, but it's always assessing how do we get more indicators out more quickly in a real-time automated fashion, and that is, as Admiral Rogers indicated earlier, that is continuing to be a work in progress.
Steve, anything to add?
Agree with everything that the guys have said. There is one thing that, though, presupposes this probably goes to your second. I'm reading ahead into probably your second question. And I may sound slightly contrarian at this, but I absolutely deeply agree with the fact that we've got to share a lot of data. But as much as we may yearn for it, it doesn't burst forth naturally in terms of why should I share with you? And so what we found within the defense industrial base, and we began working on this in a program that began in 2007, where we invited 16 companies into a session. And those were principally the large integrators, as they're known, in the federally funded research and development centers. And one of the things we immediately heard from those companies is, so this is about sharing. And if it's you, the government, saying that, that means you industry guys tell us everything you know and we'll call you if we got questions, right? And so we knew that there were some significant barriers, obviously, right there. And so we set out to really work through those very deeply. And there were a number of things that we did to develop some trust issues with those companies. And that's led from 16 companies in 2008 when we really began the program to about 400 today. And so, but they're differentiated into different things that we do. The first thing was, tell us what you need from your industry value proposition to work your issues in network security, not what we think as government guys. So how can we build a product that is efficient for you to use? And we listen very closely to that. The second thing that as part of that we did, and two key things that we heard from every industry guy in the room is, so who are you going to tell? Because there's an impact on our equity value, and oh, by the way, we absolutely think there's an impact on our procurement future. So what are you going to do, DoD, to allay that concern? And so as a start point, we agreed to anonymize the reporting, and that we also agreed to anonymize the company identity and any subsequent reporting we did that we shared across the partnership and with government. And so that was the start point. And so trust is like morale. It's easy to say, it's tough to build. You got to build it and earn it every day, right? Like building a customer. Other things we did since 2008, we've done over 32,000 hours of malware analysis for companies who have submitted malware samples to us. There's a cost avoidance issue for companies there, and we think another incentive. So why should we share with DoD? So we're at the point now where we can have some very, very spirited discussions without walking away with bruised feelings, because each party in that believes that that there's equity on both ends of that, and we've got the other guy's interests at heart. The other thing that's also an incentive for companies in this process, we do routine technical exchanges with all the companies. And so there are companies of different sizes and skill levels. And so it's not just the government talking about issues, it's companies sharing among themselves in a circle where they've all agreed that it's better to cooperate than to compete. And so that is a trust building issue for companies that I think promotes a sharing that would not otherwise natively occur.
I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on that issue, and I'll draw a parallel here, and I know it's not exactly an analogy. I mean, there are some distinctions here, but before 9/11, in terms of terrorist threat information sharing, we had a big challenge in our country in being able to connect the dots. And we basically lived in an environment of need to know. And after 9/11, there was a great push, and I remember being, working in the special operations community, there was a great push to move from need to know to need to share. And that was a big cultural change for a lot of organizations. And I would argue many of them still have, many of those organizations with those, with a cultural propensity to stay in the need to know environment still have challenges with that. But what we found over time was that when you're balancing risk, there's actually a greater risk at a more catastrophic event by staying in those silos. And so we moved, I think, pretty effectively, maybe not completely, but pretty effectively, to more of a need to share environment. And trust was a big factor in that. And you heard Mark McLaughlin talk earlier today about the Cyber Threat Alliance. So a private sector group of private sector competitors agreeing that rather than treating cyber threat information as a commercial commodity, treating it as a public good, because there's more overall to gain by everybody, better for everyone than best for a single entity. We also know that government doesn't exactly share very rapidly and very well. It has not traditionally done that between government and the private sector. And so I would just like to, I'll ask Steve first on this issue of building trust, since you've been at this for a decade with the Defense Industrial Base. And you mentioned some of the issues associated with getting to that level of trust where you've gone from 16 to over 400. So what are some of the secrets at maintaining that trust? I'm sure this is something that has to be continually cultivated in order, or it'll draw back. And then I just asked Greg and Jim your assessment of this dynamic in government of moving from need to know to need to share, similarly with the terrorist threat information and to the cyber threat information. And are we making any progress at generating cyber threat intelligence that is ready-made to be shared? Tear line procedures, et cetera. Are we making progress there? But I'll start with Steve.
So this is maybe will sound a little odd for a government guy, but we set out at DC3 to approach this much like a commercial enterprise. Could we build a product that industry guys would buy if they had choices, and they all have, and you always have choices in industry. And so one of the things that we did was listen very closely to the customer's requirements. What do you need in terms of a cyber threat product? How are you going to employ it in your enterprise? How do you want to receive it? One of the things we heard, notwithstanding the fact that the world is moving towards sticks taxi, and that's a good thing, but we heard very clearly, we're not ready to eat that. We want to eat in comma separated value format at the beginning. And so we published sets of unclassified indicators on a continuing basis to the companies. What we also agreed in terms of that is, in terms of a trust model, is let's mutually agree to a tiering scheme about things that are important to us. Tier 1 would be confirmed advanced persistent threats that affects DoD content in your network. Tier 2, suspected advanced persistent threat. And I should make as a note, our sharing data was very sharply focused on offshore, or what we've come to call advanced persistent threats. But as we began to work this with the partners, they said, so look, many of us have small network security staffs. Make this more efficient for us. Can you identify where each of these indicators should be deployed in the kill chain? That would make it a lot easier for us. It'll save us time and dollars. And we did that. So on a day-to-day basis, how do you make your product work for your customer? The other thing that was, I think, absolutely essential, and we got about 4 years into this, a CIO from a key partner said, so when you promised in 2008 that you would maintain our identity as confidential and that you would anonymize our reporting, we thought you were absolutely full of BS. But you've been as good as your word. And that's been important. And we work that issue every day because you can lose it in a day, right? And as we've moved forward into this, what we've done is, I think, something that is an extension of the trust model. There are things that the government guys in the room asked about in 2008 that the industry partners in the room said, that's just the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. We're absolutely not going to consider that. Fast forward to the last couple of years, see industry partners who have said, we're considering, for example, for special categories of DoD customers establishing standalone enclaves. You know, we're going to take a taser to anybody that tries to bridge that to the corporate backbone. What do you think? That is a massively different discussion than we began with a few years ago. From the government side, it's a massively different orientation from the FBI and from NSA and from others in terms of what we now agree to move to the unclassified level and publish to defend and stop the bleeding, rather than to preserve for some government-only outcome. I think that needs to be said in this in terms of where the government at writ large has moved in recognizing that there are other issues that fit into this. So I think that's all of those things go towards sustaining this.
Jim or Greg?
Yeah, I'll pile on. You know, one of the things that we've been doing in the NCCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, boy, that's a mouthful, isn't it? You know, what we've done is we've brought the public sector and the private sector together in the NCCIC itself. So we have folks from not only DHS, but all the other different departments and agencies have representatives in the NCCIC, law enforcement, intelligence community partners, and private sector partners represented through the ISACs are members of the NCCIC. We have over 1,600 different folks that are badged and come in based upon the operational tempo. And one of the things that we've been getting feedback on from the private sector folks in particular is, you know, we show them what we got. So they're seeing, based upon their clearance level, and oh, by the way, they get cleared up to, you know, the TS-SCI level, they actually see the intel with us. And some of them, frankly, are disappointed. They say, oh, that's it? You know, we're making sure, though, as a team, that we're working to make sure that we get tier lines out there so we can broadly share information as much as we can. But we face that anonymization issue as a twin-edged sword, because, you know, frankly, that's part of our ethos. We're going to protect the brands and reputation of those who share with us. But often there's some folks who say, hey, I want more. I want to know who the victim is, because it will help me provide a contextual element in dealing with this in my particular enterprise. So we run a very delicate balance there when it comes to protecting and anonymizing. But that said, you know, it's more than just the automated information sharing. It's having the conversations. It's posting the information on multiple platforms so that different constituencies can have access to the information, knowing what is currently out there. And one of the things that we're doing right now is we're actually piloting a reputation scoring system for this threat information, so that you can get from us what our assessment is, with 10 being the most dangerous down to 1 being the least dangerous, so that when we see something and we say something, you're going to get our best opinion as to what the severity level is to help you make better informed decisions.
So I think a lot of the the incentive to go from need to know to need to share was really about changing of the focus of the FBI, particularly as it relates to terrorism, in terms of prevention. We had to be in the business of not investigating terrorism events, but preventing them from occurring to begin with. So that really drove and at the time, Director Mueller, really about how do we build the capacity to share information. So generally, to give you a sense of the numbers of IIRs, these intelligence information reports, the raw intel that we send to the community, my sense was the Bureau was probably around less than 1,000 in 2001. We were into the tens of thousands of raw IIRs that we send out to the community. So that's just one metric, one way to kind of describe how we're sharing information with the U.S. government. We also have a variety of systems in place, not the least of which is something called Guardian, where we track all these incidents, where state and locals have the visibility into the Guardian system for terrorism. But we also have something under Executive Order 13636, the FBI is responsible for implementing something called Cyber Guardian, which also tracks cyber incidents across the community. And Greg's shop, as well as mine, are involved in deconfliction and coordination on a lot of these cyber incidents. So again, there's a lot of work that's ongoing. It's going to take some time. I'm all about sharing indicators, but I will tell you that the value of indicators diminishes very quickly because of the nature of the threat, where actors are on and off of infrastructure. So it is a far more complicated problem than simply getting indicators from the FBI or DHS or Cyber Command or NSA or any of the major cybersecurity vendors out there. This is a very complicated, very evolving environment right now. So.
Go ahead.
May I just do an amplification on that? Jim's absolutely right. Indicators themselves are not the standalone solution. And we collectively work to make sure that we're identifying and shaping and developing best practices. And we share that kind of information as well, so that folks will understand what one of their peers is learning and doing to better protect themselves. And they say that copying is the highest form of flattery. So knowing what the best practices are and what the consequences could be if you don't use these, I think is one of the best information sharing mechanisms that we have. And out of the NCIC, we're putting out 48 different products per day on average, 7 days a week, that not only are telling you what we're seeing from a cyber threat aspect, but also the best practices that we in the community are seeing to help you better align your defenses and your operational business practices.
Steve?
I could take an alibi to add on to. So why should a company participate in a sharing circle with the DOD as a DIB contract? How many folks in the room sell to DOD or have a contract? Okay. Well, if you don't, or if you do, you're going to find that there's now the advent of some mandatory reporting criteria, and some that will be contract dependent based on a change in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And as you may have gotten into this, you'll notice it says if you're going to sell to DOD or have a contract with DOD, you've got to adopt some controls that are crosswalk from the new NIST Special Pub 800.171. Well, if you have a circle where you've got a lot of folks who feel like they can roll up their sleeves and talk very bluntly after you've established a trust model, you can get input from your industry partners to the effect like, do you guys have any idea what two-factor authentication will do to a manufacturing operation? And you can get that in very vivid terms. So if you didn't have that kind of dialogue, you probably wouldn't get that. And so one of the things that you've seen as a result for the parties in the room and the companies in the room just saying very bluntly, look, you guys need to reconsider that, and here are about 50 reasons why, is that you've seen a deferral of the implementation or the requirement, not a waiving or a suspension of it, but a deferral while the companies work through that with the Department of Defense. you didn't have this relationship and a set of issues, that'd be a far more difficult kind of process, I think.
I'd like to turn the conversation to something that's in the news a lot these days, and it's the security versus privacy issue. I say security versus privacy. I actually believe that, security is a requirement for privacy, but there's a lot of heated rhetoric around that too. And whenever I'm asked a question about it, based on my previous career and my current career, I always say I have a great deal of respect for both sides of this argument. So what I'd like to do is just get some thoughts about how we have a respectful, honest discussion about the issues associated with this very complex topic, and maybe some thoughts that you'd like to share. And I'll start with Jim.
I thought your first question was going to be about the Hillary Clinton investigation and that matter, so I appreciate you not asking me that particular topic. So Director Comey's spoken a lot about this topic, and I think as John has, I have a lot of great respect and have a pretty good understanding of both sides of this discussion. I think, as the Director mentioned, it's really something that we believe should be decided by Congress, that's a decision for the legislative branch and the President ultimately to make, rather than individual companies making those types of decisions, which would essentially prevent law enforcement, prevent the government from being able to lawfully pursue individuals that are threats to national security or have committed crimes in the United States. So I do understand the complexities of the legal environment here as compared to, say, in other countries, the technology in terms of the direction that it's going. So this is something that I think, again, to speak for the Director, it's really about having that dialogue at the right in the right venue, which is really on the Hill, to really make that kind of decision rather than companies unilaterally making that choice for the government. So anyway, I think that's seems to be a lot of continued discussion for sure, with a whole host of unfortunate tragedies that have happened over the last month or two. I'm sure this will resurface, but in the interim, we've been dealing with a lot of other kinds of horrible kind of events. So.
Jim, do you think that the issue of security versus privacy in a terrorism context or counterterrorism context taints the discussion when we're talking about the cyber threat and cyber information sharing?
It certainly it heats it up a lot because we're talking about the loss of human life. And for the most part, cyber right now, although that very well will likely change, that we haven't really been dealing with loss of life. We're talking about data theft, we're talking about destruction. But when that does lead to loss of life, particularly in the critical sectors, the energy sector, that could change the dynamics. So, yeah, it complicates it for sure, but terrorism's not the only, and certainly at the federal level, it's not just about the issues between privacy and security and as it relates to terrorism. State and locals have this same type of challenge, a whole host of violent crime types of issues that they're looking at. So this is not an FBI, Apple kind of conversation. This is privacy and how does that, kind of the current state of how it's used, fit in with our society and how the expectations that we have for law enforcement to deal with these issues. So this is a highly complicated problem. I'm hopeful that somewhere down the road we'll be able to strike a healthy balance on both, but just a lot more work to be done.
Greg or Steve?
I think Jim is absolutely right that this is something that we really need to have a solid public conversation on. And I think there's a lot of generational elements that are involved in this as well. I would venture to say that a good third of the people in this room who have Facebook accounts actually have put their real birth date on their Facebook account. That's just an exemplar that I just randomly check with folks to see, have you in fact surrendered some of your privacy voluntarily without thinking about it? And I find some of the older folks tend to say, why would I want to do that? We need to have, I believe, a very sober and complete public conversation on what constitutes privacy, what elements should we be looking at throughout society. And I do believe that is something that members of the legislative branch are already considering, and that needs to have some additional follow-through. As we take a look at our operation at the NKIC, as I've previously mentioned, we work assiduously to protect brands, reputations, privacy, civil rights, civil liberties. We even have a privacy and civil liberties oversight board where we have folks from the private sector who do the over-the-shoulder with us on a regular basis just to make sure that our procedures and our processes are in fact protecting privacy, protecting the identities of those who share with us. And frankly, everybody who's in the NKIC doesn't have the same need to know. So we do anonymize, and we also segregate based upon need to know, just to protect the privacy and preserve the civil rights and civil liberties. So I think Jim is spot on, and we're doing our best to make sure that our procedures that we have right now are considered best in class, and we're asking for oversight, and we're getting plenty of help from members of our oversight board to make sure that we're staying the track.
I want to save some time for questions, so I'll ask one final question of you before we go to the audience. And this one is really more on the technical level. So you heard Mark McLaughlin talk earlier this morning about the issue of the secret to success in information sharing and reversing that math problem that he spoke about was being able to determine, turn unknown threats into known threats very rapidly, automatically sharing those threats, and then the third part was the really hard part, automatically reprogramming to do something about that. So there's been a lot of information sharing at manual level, sharing PDF files, etc. We've talked a little bit about Styx Taxi. What I'd like to ask is your thoughts about, looking to the future at getting at the scale and speed issues that we need to really begin to prevent threats rather than just standing at crime scenes and do something about them in an automated way. Where do you see, what's the current status and where do you see us heading? And I'll start with Greg.
One of the things that we're doing is we're helping to fund a lot of research and development in adaptive cyber defense. And we're doing it in partnership with DoD and other agencies where we're working with academia and other researchers to basically figure out how do we have adaptive cyber defensive mechanisms so that the machines will help us in identifying and categorizing kind of an integrated attack warning and attack assessment capability, and then use the power of the computers that we control and tell what to do, but to train them so that they can dynamically adapt the defenses against the threats that are out there. So, that's one component. But recognizing that, the small and medium businesses can't necessarily afford to have that huge infrastructure. We're also looking at better mechanisms to make sure that small and medium businesses are well protected. And frankly, we're trying to help foster markets where, using cloud computing and other readily available technical techniques that are out there right now, a lot of the small and medium businesses can go to service providers who are going to have those capabilities to better protect and align their defenses so that they can protect the business needs and the operations of the smaller companies out there as well.
Steve, any successes you've seen with the DIB program, and where do you see that going in the future?
So I told Mark in a sidebar in the hallway we'd probably come at, from different paths at a converging point. I mentioned several years ago at inception when we began a voluntary partnership, there were some very difficult subjects that we broached with industry partners. And we're at a point now where some of the partners are suggesting some things to say, is it time maybe to think about a DIB 2.0 scenario? And so that discussion there cracks the door to a range of different things that, we might not have been able to talk about 5 years ago. That if we had talked about the prospect of some kind of automated sharing, 5 years ago, it might have been an idea that might have been described, you're wrong if you're right too soon. maybe that was too soon, but we've seeded a lot of issues and a lot of trust to be able to talk about things that, in terms of how you might configure that kind of scenario. And it turns out that it is not, and I think this is a really important thing, it's not necessarily the government guys at the table talking about those things. It's the industry guys at the table talking about those things. And I think if we're going to achieve karma in that regard, I think it's probably by enabling an industry solution that does that, that looks down. As most of you know, large integrators and large weapon systems have a massive supply chain with hundreds of vendors. And so it's one thing for a very large company with enormous resources to be able to work directly with either one of the cyber centers. Much different thing for Bob's Aerospace Fastener, you know, Bob and 9 other guys, to be able to comply with a set of requirements. So how do you help Bob in securing his key intellectual property so that he can focus on aerospace fasteners and not become spend 80% of his time trying to be a geek? And so I think that's maybe where this whole discussion might head.
One of the things that we're doing, and I mentioned, we're trying to shape the marketplace. We've got a program called Enhanced Cybersecurity Services, where we're giving, certified vendors, internet service providers, communication service providers. We're sharing with them all the classified and unclassified information, so all of the known threat vectors can be filtered out even before it gets to those small and medium businesses. It's still a nascent program, but we're trying to help foster and shape that marketplace.
Okay, we got about 9 minutes left. I'd like to open it up for questions of my colleagues on the panel.
A couple of things. First of all, within my organization, I've got a privacy officer embedded in our organization. So as we're going through the NCIC processes and information sharing and the like within the NCIC, we already have a privacy officer embedded, and we're doing regular audits. Training is critical and the like. But as we take a look at that Social Security number, one of the things in the Cyber National Action Plan, and I believe Cliff talked about it briefly earlier, is we're actually taking a look at the national level as to having other identification than just the Social Security number. So as that develops further, I think you're going to see more discussion on other identifiers that will take us away from just that one singular one. And that will help firebreak some privacy mechanisms there.
We're in the business of providing target notification that we have intel that a particular company or organization will be targeted for whatever vector, whatever intelligence we have. And we also provide notification that they've already been targeted and they're now a victim. And we'll work with them to the extent that they feel comfortable, whether it's with their own inter-responders or if they retained a third-party vendor or DHS or whoever. So definitely the case. Happens every day. I mean, we do victim target notification literally 365 days a year.
Absolutely.
Before I turn it back over to Nick, I want to thank my panelists, Steve Shirley, Greg Touhill, Jim Trainor. Thank you for coming here and sharing your insight. Thank you for everything that you do and your leadership. And just like I wished for Admiral Rogers, I wish you all great success in the terribly important missions that each of you have.
John, thank you, John.